Thank you to our attendees for joining us today. We will be starting shortly. Thank you. Thank you for joining us today. Please enjoy the event. And now please welcome Dean of NYU Wagner, Sherry Gleed.
Good afternoon. I'm Sherry Gleed, Dean of NYU's Robert F. Wagner Graduate School of Public Service. Welcome to the latest collaboration between NYU Wagner and the Century Foundation. Welcome to our esteemed speakers and to our guests. During today's event, you will hear from U.S. Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg about the Biden administration's historic investments in transportation. These investments aren't only going to combat climate change, they will also benefit historically marginalized communities. Following the conversation, please stay tuned for a panel discussion featuring leaders in the transportation, climate, and equity fields that will examine the ways in which policymakers can and are making meaningful progress towards a more connected, equitable, and sustainable future. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. Please note that this event is being recorded and live streamed. If you'd like to submit a question for our panelists, please do so using the Q&A feature. Now, please welcome Bradley Abelow, Board Chair of the Century Foundation.
Thank you, Sherry, for those remarks and for NYU Wagner's continued partnership. Welcome, everyone. So pleased you all could join us today. I'm Brad Abelow, Chairman of the Century Foundation. For those who are not familiar with Century, we're a progressive think tank that pursues economic, racial, gender, and disability equity in education, healthcare, and the economy. I'm thrilled to welcome today the nation's Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg. In the next hour, you'll hear about many of the department's accomplishments under Secretary Buttigieg's leadership, from the historic and bipartisan investment in our nation's infrastructure to the groundbreaking climate provisions, including in this year's Inflation Reduction Act. But I want to call out two areas in particular that the department has put front and center of its agenda from day one: equity and climate change. Never before have we had a Department of Transportation that has baked equity and sustainability into every decision, issue, and challenge they encounter. The Secretary has been extraordinarily successful in developing transportation and climate policies to move our country forward, and has been shockingly successful in the politics of turning those policies into legislation. But it seems to me that his true superpower is his ability to communicate those ideas clearly, directly, and forcefully to the public, and that has had an enormous impact on our politics writ large. With that, I'm excited to pass it over to Aisha Balagan, an urban planning student at NYU Wagner and vice chair for the Black Student Association, who will lead a conversation with the secretary. Aisha, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction, Bradley. And it looks like Secretary Buttigieg just joined the call. So I'll make sure that he is ready to go.
Hi there. The secretary is just about to sit down in one moment. He'll turn on the camera when he sits.
Great, sounds great. I guess in the meantime, I'll pass it to Sarah Kaufman, who will give us a little bit of a preview of what to expect after the conversation with Secretary Buttigieg.
Thank you, Aisha. I'm looking forward to your conversation with Secretary Buttigieg. For today's panel, we're going to look at mitigating the impacts of climate change through the parallel tracks of on-the-ground actions and systemic changes. We're hoping to answer two questions, primarily. First, how can we best move people and goods efficiently while minimizing harm to the planet? And secondly, how can we empower communities while preparing them for both tomorrow's storms and the next decade's jobs? So we'll discuss these questions through the lens of the intersection of transportation, equity, and climate change, which is clearly one of the key defining issues of our time. So I'm excited to get to talking about that in the panel after your discussion with the Secretary.
Great, thank you so much for that preview. We'll give Secretary Buttigieg just a moment to make sure he's all set to go for our conversation. But yeah, we have a really great setup of panelists and speakers here today. So I'm also really excited and thankful to be able to be a part of this conversation. Great. And while we're waiting, definitely if any of the audience members have questions, feel free to get those wheels turning in the Q&A section. We'll have time at the end to answer any questions. Great, and it looks like Secretary Buttigieg is with us and ready to go. Thank you so much for being here today.
Hi, good afternoon. How are you?
I'm great. I'm excited. How are you doing?
Good. I'll be with you. Thanks for bearing with me for the just-in-time delivery here. A couple minutes late. I apologize.
No worries. I mean, I'm sure we all understand that you're a busy person, lots of investments going on in the Department of Transportation currently. Great. I think just to get us started, the Department of Transportation, which you oversee, is one of the agencies that is covered by the Justice 40 Initiative. So for those who aren't familiar, the Justice 40 Initiative states that 40% of the overall benefits of certain federal investments flow to disadvantaged communities. Can you provide some details on what benefit means in this context and how the Department of Transportation ensures that what you define as a benefit is also considered a benefit to disadvantaged communities?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me and really appreciate the chance to be engaging you. And when I just think about the importance of the public servants and future public servants who are being trained in this program, I really appreciate the chance to engage you because we're going to be calling on this generation of thought leaders and practitioners. We're hiring as we speak here at the department, and there's never been a better time to be involved in this work. So to come very directly to your question, we know that the benefits of transportation infrastructure have not been shared evenly or equally in the past in this country. And that goes to everything from the simple availability or non-availability of good transit or good roads or other good transportation assets in overburdened and underserved communities, to things that are a little bit second order but very important, like access to clean air, which is impacted by siting decisions and technology decisions about ports, airports, highways, roads, and transit. And importantly, the work associated with actually delivering big infrastructure projects. So in a moment like this, where we're making the biggest investment in public transit in history, biggest investment in rail since the creation of Amtrak, some of which, by the way, is quite close to home for you all. We just broke ground on the Portal North Bridge, which was originally built during the Roosevelt administration, the Teddy Roosevelt administration, and is now being replaced and will benefit over, I think, about 200 trains a day, so hundreds of thousands of passengers on a daily basis who count on it. Just give you one example. The actual jobs associated with delivering the project is another example of a benefit to transportation infrastructure that has not been distributed evenly in past decisions. We have a chance to change that, and our focus on local hire, on apprenticeships, the President's Justice 40 initiative, which sets out explicit targets for how to make sure that the benefits of clean energy investments and clean infrastructure investments go to those who have been left out. Those all allow us to be very intentional, compel us to be very intentional about how to make this not only the most ambitious infrastructure investment in modern times, but also the most equitable.
Great. Thank you so much for your answer. And I really appreciate how you're weaving in not just transportation, but also clean air. That kind of has to do with one of your ideas that you've been promoting recently. And the title of this event, Transportation Policy is Climate Policy. I think one area where the connection between these two fields is really interesting is within electric vehicles, right? On one hand, we have technology that's allowing for zero or little to no emissions at the tailpipe. But on the other hand, we also have this technology that is currently dependent on lithium mining and carries additional environmental implication when it comes to the generation and transportation of energy. So given this context, given this duality, how can we ensure that we're truly capturing clean power as we move toward the electrification of vehicles?
Well, I think in all policymaking, you have to confront the fact that we are dealing not with the ability to eliminate impacts, but choosing which impacts are most important to address. That's true when we're talking about the effect that road building has on a community. The only way to have no road building impact is to have no roads. Or whether we're talking about the energy use involved and the materials used and involved in electric vehicles. What we know, though, is that climate pollution and gas pollution from gas-powered vehicles is one of the main elements that is contributing to transportation's share of climate change. And we know that even if you assume, for the sake of argument, that all of the electricity going into an EV is made from fossil fuels generated in fossil fueled generation plants, it's still more energy efficient to turn those fossil fuels into electricity at utility scale, transmit that electricity to a car, charge that car, than it is to individually load a few gallons of that fossil fuel into millions of cars and set it on fire in one engine at a time, which is what we do right now. So the point is, you start with that baseline, and then the great thing about our energy mix is it will get cleaner over time. It's true that it's only as clean as the energy that goes into it, but it's also true that we are moving in a direction of less carbon intensive and less pollution intensive electricity generation, I would say each passing year, and we'll continue to do that. Now, there's also the manufacturing of EVs, and that's something where there are a lot of very interesting conversations happening right now with the car manufacturing companies about how to be, for example, less dependent on things like cobalt, which from a human rights perspective, as well as an environmental impact perspective, are very problematic. And you know, the truth is the chemistry of batteries has not completely kind of stabilized. I don't mean in a chemical sense, but in a market sense. This is something that's still evolving in terms of how the technology is used. But what we really need to do is recognize that nothing will be free of impact. But we need to prioritize the things that are going to have the least impact or have impacts in different ways. It's the same as the I think the reckoning that's happening within the environmental movement about nuclear power generation, which is not about waving away the environmental concerns that come with nuclear power generation. It is about recognizing that if the number one problem right now is carbon, then a form of energy generation which is carbon-free, though not pollution-free, is one that deserves more attention than one that is carbon intensive. And these are the kinds of trade-offs and choices that we're making right now. Nothing's a panacea, but some of what we're doing could have radical positive implications for our environment on a short time scale. And that's the other thing that's exciting about EVs. We're working hard on hard to decarbonize sectors of transportation, like aviation and shipping. It's going to take a while to be able to have, for example, alternative forms of propulsion for aviation, or even a sustainable aviation fuel, which there is such a thing, but it's not being produced at scale. On the other hand, the technology for EVs is here right now. People are buying these things at car dealers as we speak. So the challenge there is to make it more affordable, more accessible, easier to charge. And then, of course, over time, to make sure that the energy sources and the production of the vehicles themselves becomes always cleaner than it used to be.
Thank you, Secretary Buttigieg. I saw a lot of applauses in the chat. I think that's a really interesting way to think about impact and what it means to mitigate and what it means to eliminate. I think I'd be interested in hearing you talk a little more of when we're talking about lessening our impact through new technology. How can we make sure that future transportation policy and future technology within the transportation sector kind of meaningfully reduces emissions and impacts specifically within the communities that have historically been subject to the most impact, the most pollution?
So a couple of things I think are really important to bear in mind. First of all, the voice of the communities themselves. So making sure that we have planning processes and policy processes that include the voices of people who have been excluded in the past is critically important to getting this right. And we've sought to do that in the creation of the infrastructure law, and certainly are working to do that in its implementation, with a high degree of public engagement and a lot of involvement by our Departmental Office of Civil Rights to ensure that these questions of community engagement are answered on the front end rather than at the 11th hour, which, by the way, also has projects done on time, to take that community input on board and be willing to examine things that need to be done differently early rather than late. The other thing is that we have it really built into the design of the infrastructure package and the legislation to make investments in places that will benefit from this kind of attention to equity and to inclusion in terms of where people will notice the difference, not just in terms of being able to use a different and better transportation resource. That's huge. Just having a better, more reliable bus service, or a more frequent subway service, or a better road or bridge in your neighborhood. But also recognizing that the technologies and the equipment and the infrastructure that are used impacts people who aren't directly involved in the transportation enterprise itself. And a good example of this is ports. Typically, the communities of people who live nearest to ports are Black and Latino residents. It is also typically the case that there are measurable public health impacts, like higher rates of asthma in and around ports, where you have ships burning fuel that has a high level of pollution associated with it, and a lot of trucks coming and going. So if you can electrify the trucks, or improve the pollution coming from the ships, or use technology called cold ironing, which, to simplify a little bit, basically means plugging a ship in when it's at dock at berth, instead of having it run its engines in order to power its onboard equipment. Those things have a benefit for people who live in the community who are impacted by shipping, even if they don't have anything to do with shipping professionally. And those are the things that we need to look at that are built into the priorities that we're using to decide how grants are being used. And in many cases, built into the legislation itself.
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer, Secretary Buttigieg. and definitely appreciate your attention that you and your department are giving to historically marginalized and overburdened communities. I think on that note, during your time as Secretary of Transportation, the Department of Transportation has actually established its own definition of disadvantaged communities to use within your policies and programs. Can you talk a little bit about why it was important for your department to create its own definition and what impact that definition has had on recent infrastructure investments you have undertaken?
Yeah, so the basic thinking here is that you have to be able to measure these things and find them in order to act on them. And I know that might sound like kind of managerial or technocratic speak, but it's also clear that for there to be any accountability around the use of these funds, we have to make decisions up front about how to define a disadvantaged community, how to define community benefit, even how to define what clean transportation infrastructure really looks like. And so making sure that we went through the exercise as a department and on an interagency basis where we're working with partners across the administration. Because remember, this is part of our slice of this infrastructure package. It's about half of the overall 1.2 trillion. You have electric school buses being overseen by the EPA along with the water investments. You have broadband investment being overseen by the Department of Commerce. You have the Army Corps of Engineers. There are a lot of different players here, although we're the single biggest piece representing about half of it. And so we've got to make sure that we have a transparent, inclusively defined basis for saying these are examples of communities that have experienced these kinds of disadvantages in the past, often even directly because of transportation decisions that were made. Now, there's not just in a vacuum are these communities disadvantaged, but you look at how, I was just in Detroit, I-375, which we're going to, we're providing $100 million to help the community take this road, which basically cuts like a kind of a gash, dividing a neighborhood from downtown, and during its construction destroyed 2 Black neighborhoods. And we're going to elevate it to a boulevard type of streetscape, which will benefit everybody. But every community has an example of something like this, an interchange, highway, a railway that has created a boundary or in its construction removed communities, almost always communities of color that were disadvantaged. So we need to take account of this. And I mean this in a very literal sense. We need to literally account for the impacts and account for what we're doing about it. And what's so exciting about this infrastructure law is it gives us the resources, not just to offer moral support for disadvantaged communities, but actual funding to help make things better.
Again, thank you so much for that answer, Secretary Buttigieg. It looks like I only have a few more minutes left with you, so I'll kind of transition into kind of a bigger question. Thank you for bearing through all of my policy questions. But I'd be really interested in hearing from you on how you think my peers in the class of 2023 will be commuting in the next 30 years.
Great question. One of my colleagues has pointed out that we tend to overestimate what technological change will mean in the short term and underestimate what it'll be in the medium to long term. And so I like the framing of your question because I think that's the scope where the biggest changes will happen. Consider something like automated cars, which has been described as being 7 years away for about 10 years. And clearly is taking longer to drive the kind of radical transformations we envision than people would have expected 10 or 12 years ago. And yet we know that certainly by the time we get to the middle of the century, there will be some profound differences to what it means to get around in a vehicle compared to what it's like today. We can't always predict these changes. After all, the most important transportation technology of the last decade turned out to be the smartphone. It's not even obviously a piece of transportation technology, but between ride sharing, GPS mapping, and the impact it's had even on active transportation like bike and scooter sharing, it's probably done more than any other invention to change transportation in a short period. So we have to have some humility about exactly what's going to happen. Somebody told me that just a few weeks ago was the date that is notionally the birthday of George Jetson. And when we get into Jetsons style transportation, I don't know. But we are seeing what's called advanced air mobility. In other words, these vertical takeoff and landing and sometimes automated flight things. And again, by the middle of the century, maybe not part of a daily commute, Jetson style, but certainly part of what a network serving an airport looks like. I imagine that by the middle of the century, we'll have more excellent and routine use of transit, not only by people who are considered to be transit dependent, but just as a means of choice for getting around, which is not true in most American communities, although New York might be an exception. The place where, as one thinker once put it, you have an indication of civilization that isn't how many poor people have cars, but how many rich people use the subway. I think we will have a more equitable level of access to transportation, but also, if we get this right, by the middle of the century, economists will agree that part of how we closed racial wealth gaps in this country will have been the wealth created through the construction of transportation infrastructure in the 2020s. And that's an exciting thing to think about too. Everything from land use to carbon pollution will be very, very different in the middle of the century, thanks to the investments we're making right now. But that's why there's so much pressure to get it right. And you and your classmates are going to play a huge role in delivering it. We're just at the outset of this infrastructure decade. And a huge part of whether things unfold as successfully as they might is the talent that we need to bring to bear on actually getting this stuff done, which is why I'll circle back a little bit to where I began, which is we're hiring. The transportation sector more generally is looking for brilliant, diverse, capable, public-spirited people. And we're going to need it in every aspect of transportation, from cybersecurity to aviation to city design. And hopefully I will find many of those participating in this call to be colleagues in the future.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Secretary Buttigieg. Thank you so much for the plug. I hope I'm not talking over anybody right now, but really appreciate your answers and the time you're able to spend to speak to our audience today. And now please welcome our moderator for the panel, Sarah Kaufman, Interim Executive Director, NYU Rudin Center for Transportation and Adjunct Associate Professor of Urban Planning.
Thank you, Aisha. Thank you for continuing to be one of our star students. I hope you are eager to be one of Secretary Buttigieg's employees one day. And Secretary Buttigieg, thank you for your comments. Very important remarks, and we really appreciate your contributions. So as was discussed earlier, there is so much to be done at the intersection of transportation, equity, and climate change. Of course, we need to ensure that people can enjoy access to job opportunities and social travel, but also we have to set a course towards a healthier planet. So in today's panel, we're going to look at mitigating the impacts of climate change through both policy and action. So I'm thrilled to welcome two incredible change makers to discuss their work on these thorny issues. Peggy Shepard, co-founder and executive director of We Act for Environmental Justice, and Sonam Villani, founder and CEO of Streetlife Ventures. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah.
So we'll start out with you, Sonam, because just last week, you introduced this concept, which you called climate industrialism. Can you tell us more about that idea and how it specifically relates to cities?
Yeah, and thanks again to Sarah, to NYU, to TCF and DOT for having us here. I'll start off with cities, right? On a personal level, I am fascinated by the history of cities. I used to work down the street from the site of the Pearl Street Station down in Lower Manhattan. And for all the students here, it's actually where Thomas Edison built the country's first power station and illuminated Wall Street. And we know that the same thing happened with steel mills in Pittsburgh and manufacturing plants in Detroit, and countless innovations across the country. And at Streetlife, we think that these stories can be repeated as we enter what we call the age of climate industrialism. So it's where innovation industrialization and urbanization go hand in hand, just as they did during the American Industrial Revolution, and fuel investments in housing and infrastructure and build local economies, all with the technologies that aren't relying on coal, as Thomas Edison did, but on solar and wind and hydrogen fuel cells and heat pumps. My personal favorite, e-bikes, right? All in all, what we call the sustainable hardware of cities to drive new jobs and development going forward. And we see a lot of this in the early innings playing out in different cities across the US. Right here in New York, in our backyard at Governor's Island, we're launching a new climate solution center, transforming a former Army base into an R&D hub with about 7,000 new jobs for all skill levels. In Lansing, Michigan, GM is building a new EV battery plant, and the local school district is actually working with a startup called GreenLink Education. And they retrofit the school's buildings to be more energy efficient, and they're designing training programs to help students learn about the manufacturing process and get them ready for apprenticeships as the plant opens. And these are great jobs, right? These are paying starting salaries of $60,000 a year. Another example, I'm just coming back from Alaska, where I was lucky enough to meet the Alaska Ocean Cluster in Anchorage. And they're building these extremely cool sail drones and aquaculture sensors to benefit the city's ports and maritime economy, and transitioning away, frankly, from relying on oil drilling for tax revenues. So it's really the role of cities, not just to house the R&D and create jobs, but what we see is also to adopt and deploy climate tech solutions to achieve their own net zero goals. There are about 6,000 cities across the globe that have climate action plans. That's a very large number, but there aren't enough companies to meet the mandates that many cities have set for themselves. And at Street Life, we actually partner with cities to bring a lot of the early stage technology ideas into a commercialization process. So that means we work with cities and say you have an EV charging startup, right? The city can help them figure out who owns which part of the street, or how they can get the Con Ed electricity connection, or what the design specification should be, and especially how to actually deliver those projects in underserved communities that need it most. So that might mean going to the South Bronx before Midtown Manhattan and really leveraging the Justice $40 and the investments that Secretary Buttigieg spoke about, and really a partnership to co-develop these technologies from the start. So cities can also support this through the deployment of advanced purchase commitments, simplify the permitting and procurement process. Secretary Buttigieg used to be mayor, so I know he appreciates this, but his friend Mayor Peduto of Pittsburgh used to say that we have to roll out the red carpet rather than put up the red tape. Right. And I think that's the crux of climate industrialism. It's not about scarcity and sacrifice, but very much so an optimistic and action-oriented response to climate doom and gloom with a focus on equity and really getting it right from the start. And hopefully coming to a city near you.
Thank you, Sonam. Those were some really cool examples of new technologies being developed, new partnerships in the works. And it's really exciting to hear about the work being done. And especially in your concept of climate industrialism. So thank you. Peggy, I'd like to bring the discussion over to you because while Sonam talked about city and neighborhood level solutions, Peggy, you've been working with communities. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about at the community or neighborhood level, how can we tap into infrastructure to revitalize it and sustain it for the communities that need it the most?
Yeah, certainly. And good afternoon, everyone. Again, I'm Peggy Shepard. I'm the co-founder and executive director of We Act for Environmental Justice, based in Harlem, with an office in DC as well. Well, the disinvestment in infrastructure has really had a lot of impacts. It's catalyzed environmental degradation that has had really serious economic consequences in communities of color and low income. It's also led to the targeting of communities of color and low income for polluting facilities. We have excess and cumulative exposure to multiple environmental hazards. And it also has meant a lack of green benefits, a lack of investment in community infrastructure, and really a void of community participation in democratic decision-making. Now, I think this disparate impact has really led to disproportionate exposure to pollutants. We have numbers of studies that demonstrate that it's really been a very disproportionate impact on vulnerable populations, such as children, the immunocompromised, and the elderly. And it really puts residents at a higher risk of mortality and morbidity from a whole host of chronic diseases. So I think when we look historically, we understand that this environmental justice crisis really results from, I think, a legacy of housing segregation, appropriation of tribal lands, land use and zoning discrimination, and of course, inequitable law enforcement. But, you know, there's a growing awareness that place matters, that neighborhood environmental conditions, meaning housing, transportation, economic development, land use and zoning, open space, access to quality food, all of these are environmental conditions that lead to community sustainability. But we understand that these spheres actually directly impact community health and sustainability. So the zip code we live in is really an important determinant of our health, but infrastructure can sustain neighborhoods when communities have been engaged seriously on identifying the needs and concerns. You know, so often, you know, there are opportunity zones and a variety of tax incentives that are given to developers to do whatever they want in a community. And as a resident, we don't even know who's received these tax credits. And those developers have no idea what the community is really feeling that it needs. So one thing my organization is doing is working in East Harlem to encourage infrastructure investment so that we can enhance a very dysfunctional and dilapidated transit hub along Harlem's main commercial corridor. So as our 2nd Avenue subway is completed, we really envision that the 2 subway lines there can be linked with the Metro North station into a real vibrant, clean, and culturally centered hub of small business, tourism, and pedestrian activity. So with the funds that the federal government is now trying to get out the door, there are funds that can really do this kind of infrastructure and investment that can really enhance economic activity. But again, only if the community has been a part of identifying those needs and concerns. And also we need to be looking at whether some of these investments are in flood zones or not. And that becomes very important, that when we are redeveloping or investing in these transit hubs, that we understand what mitigation or adaptation may be needed.
Thank you, Peggy. Actually, that brings me to my next question, which is the division between mitigation and adaptation. And as we know, it is the 10-year anniversary of Hurricane Sandy, which led to a great deal of flooding and damage to our streets and transit systems and homes. So Sonam, can you talk about what the key differences are in mitigation and adaptation, what they look like, and what is the best balance of investment and policies going forward in terms of mitigating versus adapting to our new reality? You're on mute.
I think one of the greatest things, and unfortunately it's a reaction to a lot of the things that we've seen, particularly over the past 4 or 5 years when it comes to climate disasters, is that there's a lot of good news, right? Governments are making historic investments, companies are setting net zero targets, There are literally dozens of people I talk to every month who want to work on climate. Hopefully many of them can get jobs at DOT. But the bad news is that a lot of the talent and resources is only going to one half of the equation, right? So when we think about climate change and its impacts and what we as a human race can do about it, it falls into two categories. Climate adaptation is trying to figure out what should we be doing here and now to adapt to our changing climate and frankly a much warmer world. And then climate mitigation is how do we actually make investments in the future, right? How can we actually reduce our GHG emissions over time and get us to sort of more normal levels that we haven't seen since the American Industrial Revolution that I was talking about earlier. We're at the moment sort of very skewed in our investments. So about 93% of all climate finance goes into mitigation. It's to reduce those GHG emissions in our atmosphere. But climate change is here and now. You don't need me to tell you that. And we've got to do something about it right today and not all the way in 2050. So we really got to amp it up on the adaptation side. And particularly because, as Peggy was saying, right, climate change impacts low income and minority communities most, often to the tune of 3, 4, 5 times more so than neighboring counterparts, right? So there's this huge mismatch, not only in the dollars that we're investing, but also where some of those dollars are going and how they're being received by, or not received, frankly, by some of these communities. So this is really, the case when we're talking about rebuilding, as we did here in New York after Hurricane Sandy, and will after Hurricane Ian in Florida, that just a few weeks ago. And we often say build back better, right? And everybody has a different definition of what better means. And for us, better really means building back with climate solutions that have co-benefits for adaptation and for mitigation. Right. So first and foremost, it's about starting with data, right? And platforms like FloodMap or Jupiter that help us understand where our risk lies. Next, it's about getting our finances in order and to create effective insurance programs and having reserves on hand to provide social safety nets for those who are most vulnerable in our communities. And finally, it's actually about proactive investments, right? So in my 20s, I used to work at the World Bank on sort of climate resiliency efforts all over Asia. And there's this one number that I'll never forget. And it's that if we invest $1 on pre-disaster mitigation, we save about $6 in post-disaster losses, right? So let's make sure that we're using that $1 on things like nature-based solutions for shoreline defenses, oyster beds or kelp forests that protect against storm surge and facilitate urban cooling so that we use less energy. They sequester carbon, they promote biodiversity. You can tell I love oysters, but that's one example, right? Another example is more so at the neighborhood level or the building level, right? Let's make sure that we are building new communities next to sustainable public transit investments funded by DOT, right? Next to subway lines and streetcar lines and bus rapid transit and bike lanes, not all off in the middle of nowhere where you're very much so reliant on a car to get from point A to point B, even if it's an electric vehicle. When we're rebuilding our roads, making sure that we have underground drainage chambers so that water can be collected in some of these drainage chambers when there are heavy rainfall events, or water filtration systems on site in buildings so that we reduce water that could flood our streets, but also use that water in our buildings and reduce our water needs by about half, right? Here in New York, Auburn by the Sea is a development that I often point to, and it was one of the only parts of the Rockaway Peninsula that wasn't decimated by Hurricane Sandy. And they had the foresight to do that in 2004. So it's a lot of these resiliency investments that need to be incorporated into the city's codes and brought to these hyper-local neighborhoods.
Thank you, Sonam. And that's those are some really fantastic examples. And Peggy, I know that you have been working on some of this already in the East Harlem neighborhood in particular. You've been looking at streetscape improvements for flood-prone areas. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, exactly. again, we believe that there are just as 40 benefits that can come directly to a frontline community like East Harlem that will certainly aid in pedestrian access, aid in helping to mitigate some of the potential flooding possibilities, and really doing the kind of streetscape improvements that are so necessary. One thing we've been doing, we have helped to develop a coalition called Clean Air for the Long Haul, and we've been advocating for the EPA to adopt the strictest emission standards possible for medium and heavy duty vehicles. And one reason is because communities like East Harlem, like uptown neighborhoods, which are so close to the bridges, where we have traffic and trucks pouring into our neighborhood streets, this really becomes a very, very important issue because we know that air toxics and that diesel can really exacerbate. In some cases, we're finding the literature is telling us that it can be causal for certain cancers. So we know that these diesel trucks are emitting nitrogen dioxide and fine particles that lead to higher rates of respiratory problems, heart disease, premature death even. And again, we see recent studies that show evidence of how this kind of air pollution can cause lung cancer as well. So, you know, we really know that there's a reason communities like East Harlem, like the South Bronx, have some of the highest childhood asthma rates in the nation, because these kids are growing up in a sacrifice zone surrounded by highways, power plants, warehouses and depots, and other sources of air pollution. So one thing we've been working on as well at the state level is to get a bill passed by the state legislature that would ensure that the cumulative impacts of multiple sources of pollution are taken into consideration in the state CEQA, the State Environmental Quality Review Act. And this is really important when polluting facilities are seeking permits in frontline communities like the South Bronx. And so we're urging Governor Hochul to sign that bill into law. But again, we realize that there are a lot of opportunities for investments from the IRA, as well as the Infrastructure Act, to really begin to make a difference and really enhance many of these communities. But the other thing we realize is that they have been so underinvested in that they actually need a pre-investment to get to a baseline where we can do energy efficiencies, where we can do solar, and when we can make these transitions from fossil fuel. So again, and electrification, we're finding that a lot of buildings in frontline communities would need substantial electric upgrades in order to electrify. So again, not only do we need an investment, we need an investment just to get us to the level of other buildings to make significant investments in this new economy.
Those are excellent points. Thank you. And you bring to light so many issues, both on the local level as well as the national and state policy fronts, because this is a multi-pronged effort. And so thank you for pointing that out. I want to ask Sonam the last question, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions. You can add your question to the Q&A. Sonam, what would you say is the top investment that can be made today to improve climate change impacts and benefit the broader environment?
Yeah, I think it's really hard to pick one. But I think, you know, I'm an infrastructure nerd, right? So I'm much more biased towards atoms over bits, right? I often say that I don't necessarily need another software tool to tell me where it's going to flood in New York City, right? But I need porous concrete so that when it does rain, the water has someplace to go, right? I think a lot of the work that WEACT is doing and many other organizations in some of these communities that are vulnerable to bring these types of solutions to very hyper local streets and neighborhoods is paramount. But I often think about, when we think of cities, we say it's how do we leverage things like the trifecta of the infrastructure bill, the CHIPS Act, and the IRA to help us do a lot of the things that, that we've talked about for the past hour. And in our built environment, it's the individual unit, it's the building, and it's the neighborhood. So things like heat pumps at the unit level, right, to reduce energy consumption by about 70% often. It's using carbon neutral building materials like cross-laminated timber to reduce emissions relative to steel and concrete. It's district cooling systems at the neighborhood level, but it's also very simple design solutions, right, that have nothing to do with technology. One of my favorite laws on the books is in Cambridge in Massachusetts, where anytime a street is repaved, a bike lane is added. And it encourages modal shift out of cars and onto more sustainable forms of transportation so that you don't have the pollution levels that we currently see in many of these communities. So let's make sure that when we're putting in new sidewalks, put in the porous concrete to account for rain events, right? Put in new bioswales in our street beds. And cooling mechanisms to sequester that carbon. So really it's these sort of hyper local solutions at the city level that hopefully cities will, again, right, roll out the red carpet to facilitate these.
Thank you. And Peggy, if I can point to you for one final response, what would be at the top of your wish list? If there were something that could be done today, what would be your number one priority?
We've really got to address the impacts, emission standards of diesel trucks. I think that's just so important. Those mobile sources, especially in a city like New York.
Yes, that's an excellent point, and I see it every day, and I agree with you. So thank you both. We're going to move into audience questions now. Here's one coming in. What do you see as the major barriers local and state governments have accessing Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and other federal infrastructure money? So that can be for either of you.
Go ahead, Peggy.
I'll just start by saying that one of the major obstacles is the inefficiency and unaccountability of state and local governments. We do not know for sure, and the federal government, many of the agencies have not determined how they're going to assure that the $65 billion from the IRA actually gets to frontline communities, that the benefits of Justice 40 actually get there. We have a lot of red states and southern states that are very dependent on the fossil fuel industry and may not even be interested in getting some of those monies from these, initiatives. So to me, that's a huge obstacle.
Well, thank you. And that actually segues nicely into the next question, which Sonam, I'll point to you. What are some effective ways to advocate for public transit use in car-dependent cities? And if so, what is helpful in these conversations?
Yeah, I mean, I think first and foremost, actually investing in public transit, right? So thinking about how you as a state DOT or city DOT spend the dollars that you may get from your own tax revenues or from all of these massive investments from the federal government. And really, putting your money where your mouth is and building things like BRT systems and bike lanes. A personal example, I learned how to ride a bike when I was 30, right? And I learned on a city bike and I bike everywhere, but I only bike in protected lanes because that's where I feel safe, right? And I think that my story is repeated, millions of times around the country. So a lot of it is advocating, for those hyper local investments and using your dollars and making those conscious decisions as policymakers. I think another is around, we as citizens often do rely on cars, particularly if you don't live in a fairly well-connected place like New York, right? But how can we think about, okay, doing things like rideshare and incentivizing that, right? Building parking lots next to transit hubs so that people can drive to the hub and then take the train into downtown, right, to work. So it's a lot of these design changes, I think, that matter.
Yes, and I'm with you on the cycling, and it's actually been seen throughout this country that women are less likely to cycle on city streets because of concerns for safety. So I am aligned with you on that, and that is another factor that plays into taking more micromobility for a large part of the population. Now, this question also deals with federal policy. Congressional gridlock is at an all-time high, and climate change can't wait. What would you do if you could do anything to make an immediate impact? What are practical, more feasible steps the administration and/or Congress can take instead?
I have a thought. The
Sure.
bureaucracy is really bad. And I think this frankly applies to state, federal, and local government, right? It is extremely difficult to get any sort of money, but then also to implement it because you have to fill out thousands and thousands of forms along the way, right? So I think one thing is just something very simple, right? It's things like permitting reform, right? And making the process much easier. But when you're doing that, making sure that you're still keeping in mind potential negative consequences of a lot of these investments and dollars, right? And so that I think is one very easy, not super easy, but something that I wish all levels of government would do to make it easier to help us, frankly, just build faster, right? Because a lot of these investments we should have made 30 years ago, but are only making now, and time is of the essence.
Yes, that's a great point. And Peggy, I believe this.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say quickly, one of the things Biden has done is issued executive orders that have been able to make changes quickly. Of course, those aren't necessarily sustained in the next administration, but in some respects, it can make things happen quicker.
That's an excellent point. Thank you. And Peggy, staying with you, I think this next question is right up your alley. Transportation, climate, and equity also intersect with, deeply impact individual and collective health. When you look at your imperatives for addressing climate and transportation, how are you applying a health equity lens to your strategic vision and goals?
You know, I think the basis of the environmental justice perspective is the environmental exposure on health. So the way we really communicate environmental issues is around health impacts. So everything we do, when I talked earlier about, wanting to tackle the diesel trucks because of the emissions, the main reason there is the emissions and the impact on health, on our respiratory health, on the cardiovascular. So everything we do is through a health lens.
Thank you. That's, yes, of course, community and personal and national health, of course. And there is a response to you, Sonam, about the Cambridge Complete Streets law that you mentioned about inserting a bike lane with every new paved street. It is being challenged in court, unfortunately. How do we prevent litigation that kills good projects and ordinances?
Yeah, if you can solve the American judicial system, I think you should go work for the federal government, for President Biden, help him do that, right? But yeah, I mean, I think that it happens in Cambridge. Unfortunately, it happens in almost every city in the United States because we are built on, frankly, like a lot of band-aids of laws that have been implemented, right? And there's always something that somebody can pick at to favor their side of the argument. So I think a lot of this is also, yes, there are challenges at the judicial level, but it's also showing up, right? It's showing up to your local community board meeting and making your voice heard. Oftentimes people don't do that, right? Many of these community board meetings are attended by the same cast of characters, often who have old school thinking around some of these issues. So I think the more voices that show up at those hyperlocal levels, the less likely we are to see those challenges in court, because folks, kind of see the galvanizing mechanisms around this. And I think that there are some positive stories as well, right? Just in New York, right? The street cafes, there was a case against that made it into court and was ultimately dismissed, right? Because people love eating outside and getting rid of parking spots, right? To do so. So yeah, I mean, I don't have, there's no sort of brushstroke to solve for that, but showing up and actually sharing your opinion in that process does help.
Thank you. And that leads into what will be the final question. And I'd like to hear both of your answers. I'll summarize the question, which is basically asking about how the costs of projects here, infrastructure projects here in the United States, are extremely high, and especially high here in New York City, where the Second Avenue subway is the most expensive subway line ever built in the history of the world. So the question asks how we can keep construction costs low, which we probably won't get into right now, but how do we convince people that these projects are worth it? So that's the bigger question. How do we convince a community or a neighborhood or a city that climate forward work is worth the investment of resources and time and the pain of change? So Sonam, if you can start, and then we'll move over to Peggy.
Yeah, I've spent my entire career in the infrastructure space, and unfortunately, a lot of those dollars make me cry. But I think one of the biggest things is kind of the stat I said earlier, right? Every $1 invested in pre-disaster proactive mitigation, and a lot of that tends to be infrastructure investments, saves $6 on the back end, right? And that's just talking about adaptation. It's not even getting into the mitigation piece of the puzzle, right? And there's tons of studies that you can see online in terms of the trillions of dollars that continued emissions of GHG emissions is going to cause our economy, right? So I think those numbers speak for themselves. But yes, it is difficult when a lot of that drilling is going on your street for 10 years on end. And I think permitting reform and a lot of these other sort of nitty-gritty government bureaucracy that most people don't see is a way to reduce those costs and make these projects go faster.
Thank you. And Peggy, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think we have to communicate the cost of doing nothing. When you defer maintenance, we see what's happened in public housing. People are living in, desperate conditions with holes in the roof, vapor intrusion, mold, and lead. So the cost of doing nothing when we don't invest in our roads, or we don't invest in our bridges, or we don't invest in transit, which is the main method for people to get to work in New York City. So again, really, when we're looking at the cost benefit analysis, which government generally does, what's the cost of actually doing nothing? And what will it cost later to make these enhancements?
Thank you, Peggy. I think that's an excellent summary of the entire issue. What is the cost of doing nothing? Obviously, we have to do a lot right now. Thank you. So with that, our time has run out. I would like to extend a special thank you to our speakers and the Century Foundation and NYU Wagner. A recording will be available right away on tcf.org. And I'd like to thank all of you in the audience for joining. And to learn about future events, visit tcf.org or wagner.nyu.edu. And you can always check out our work at nyurudencenter.com. Thank you.